continue to eat, but we have to start the program. So please try to keep the noise down while we have our program started. So it is a great pleasure on behalf of CSID and the Board of Directors of CSID to welcome Mr. Jamal Khashoggi as our keynote speaker for this annual conference. Mr. Jamal is a journalist, a columnist, and an author, and I think most of you know him. He has been writing about human rights and democracy in the Arab world for a while. And the title of his presentation today is Why the Arab World Needs Democracy Now More Than Ever. So that is the title for his talk. I think it's very, very relevant 7 years after the Arab Spring to see where we are in the Arab world and where the Arab world is headed. And I think we could not think of a better keynote speaker to talk about this topic than Mr. Jamal Khashoggi. So he will speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have about 10 minutes of Q&A. Then we have another panel, keynote panel on Turkey that will start immediately after that. So welcome, Mr. Jamal. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I feel very nervous giving a keynote speech. I'm good with titles, but not a keynote speech. I'm from Saudi Arabia, where the issue of democracy and Islam are very much relevant. When a Saudi Arabian official wants to brush away the question of democracy in the past, he will always raise the debate whether democracy is compatible with Islam. Maybe he will call Masmoudi to have a conference in Saudi Arabia and discuss whether democracy and Islam are compatible. So that is the relevant relation between Saudi Arabia and this organization. This topic, it is the topic that many in this room have used to discuss, debate, write books about it, essays, until recently. But it totally was put off to an end with the coming of Arab Spring, with the people, the youth, the Islamists, even the Islamists, including the Salafis, who were very much always critical of democracy, and many of them are still until today critical of democracy, and they see some of it see it as kufr, breaking away from religion. And there are many in my country who also think democracy and Islam don't go together. But that was put all to an end with the coming of Arab Spring, the long line we witnessed in 2012 in Egypt, in Tunisia. That was a vote that the people in the Arab world were ready, and they won democracy, and they participated in democracy. Even the Islamist party, who were the topic of discussion about democracy and Islam, they all voted for democracy the moment they agreed to participate, and the moment that the people voted in overwhelmingly. And that is also will be a later argument we should use against anybody who will say Arabs are not ready for democracy. Because those pictures that are still available from 2012 that shows long lines in Egypt or in Tunisia of men, women, young and old, who were going to the polls. Nothing compared to the sham elections we saw in Egypt and elsewhere recently. But even though Saudi Arabia is approaching different form of modernity today, cinemas, art, entertainment, mixing of the sexes, opening up to the world, even departing from radicalism, and the hegemony of the religious establishment on social life. The religious establishment have a heavy hand grip on social life that influenced the livelihood of every single Saudi man and woman. Even though we are departing from that, but of course they never had a role with our political life. But Saudi Arabia, it is still not interested in democracy. We are going for all form of modernity, but not democracy. But it is no longer using that old lame excuse that democracy is not compatible with Islam. Now, with all confidence, a Saudi ruler will say to an American journalist, I have the case of the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman saying that to Jeffrey Goldberg in the Atlantic, that absolute monarchy is good. Why is that? It is the time of authoritarian, the topic of this conference. So people feel assured that there is no need for democracy. Authoritarian is good. They could argue with that. The argument that our societies, they need a great leader to lead. Democracy will undermine the ability of the great leader to lead the people to the future. Over a dinner table, in Riyadh, in Cairo, probably even in Amman, I don't know about Tunisia, you could hear from an intellectuals or a group of intellectuals who were liberal one day, advocating liberty and change and probably democracy, a statement like this: Arabs are not ready for democracy. I'm sure any of you who have been in the Arab world have heard that statement. Arabs are not ready for democracy. Even if you argue with him about that, he would maybe say, okay, even if they are ready for democracy, they don't know how to choose. They always choose wrong. Yeah. Listen to that. Later he would say, oh, the Islamists and the Muslim Brotherhood, they have kidnapped the Arab Spring. In my country, one could also add that, oh yeah, they don't know how to choose. If we have democracy, they will not vote out of their conscience. They will vote out of their tribal royalties. So basically what the argument here is that democracy is not good for us. And we need a strong leader to lead. This is a very prevailing theory that is spreading around in many parts of the Arab world. You can hear it in Egypt, from an Egyptian businessman who is believing in the system. You could hear it about a doubtful Jordanian, maybe a doubtful Tunisian about democracy, who wants to restore the old status quo. There are intellectuals. I know one of them, a good friend of mine, a Saudi Arabian who was raised abroad, who defend the term benevolent autocracy openly. He would write about benevolent autocracy in an American newspaper and think it is the best choice for Saudi Arabia. It is that notion, the old notion, al-Mustabid al-Adi, that was overkilled since what, the time of Abdurrahman al-Kawatibi. But it is coming back on us again, the benevolent autocracy or the just dictator. As much as there are many people like you who believe in democracy and want to promote democracy, now there is a very strong establishment of Arabs and non-Arabs who are anti-democracy in the Arab world. And they are really active, they have budgets, they have money, they use media, they lobbyists, they try to influence the narrative against democracy or the choice of democracy in the Arab world. Recently in Riyadh Book Fair, I wasn't able to attend, but I saw one of the books that were put on display, a book called ضد الربيع العربي, Against the Arab Spring. The author of the book had the nerve to put such offensive title on a book with his name on it, Against الربيع العربي, ضد الربيع العربي, Against the Arab Spring. Those facts. I should also mention that democracy is under attack from another group, not the liberals, contrary to the liberals, radical Islamists. They are coming back, like ISIS, like even many of the fighters who are fighting along with Haftar, the Salafi who are with Haftar in Libya. They are also against democracy, and they are breaching against democracy in the form of violence, like those Haftar guys or the ISIS people, or in mosque. So democracy is under attack from the unusual suspect, the liberals, and the usual suspect, the radical Islamists. That is why these organizations and many believers of democracy, they should resume their advocacy activity to counter this narrative, to reassure people in the Arab world who either lost hopes in democracy because of the failures, or because they fell victim to this concentrated attack on democracy coming from state-owned television, news channel, intellectuals who are attacking democracy. It is affecting the people. People are losing hope in democracy, and there is a need for this organization and other organizations to return to advocacy. Since Abdurrahman al-Kawakibi time, the famous author who pushed for reform in the late time of the Ottoman Empire, Arab intellectuals, Muslim intellectuals were pushing for democracy or hoping for democracy or some form of it. When I use the term democracy, I don't mean a literal certain democracy. It is just the broad meaning of it that includes liberty, include check and balance, include accountability, some form of democracy. We were pushing, we were hoping for that in our pursuit of good governance, equality and justice in the Arab world. Now we need it more badly just to stop killing each other. There are two kinds of Arab countries. Countries that need reform. My country is one of them. Jordan, Morocco. They're okay. They need democracy for good governance, for a check and balance. So we will not have economic disaster, for example. But a country like Libya, Syria, and Yemen, the only way out for those three countries is democracy, some form of power sharing. Awaya Jirga, Afghanistan, where you bring all the Yemenis in one huge room and force them into an agreement how to share power together. There's a need. That is the only way out for those countries, and the war are continuing in those countries because of the lack of a mechanism for power sharing. In those countries, people are killing each other because they lack the mechanism to agree on a leader, not because they want good governance. Of course, eventually they want good governance, but the priority today is just to stop the cycle of killing. Yet there is a hope in other countries who are still mired in civil or internal conflict, such as Tunisia, that is struggling to push ahead with true democratic system. But I found from many of my Tunisian friends that Tunisians, they are also worried about democracy. They don't want to influence anybody. They don't want to breach or appear as breaching to the Arabs. What they hope from the Arabs, leave us alone. Let us pursue our own democracy. Don't think of us that we are breaching to your democracy. But they still have a responsibility, and I think we should, this organization, news channels who are for freedom and change in the Middle East, to spend a great time of airtime covering the Tunisian election, the municipal election. Even though it's going to be very local, very municipal in Tunisia, but every Saudi, every Egyptian, every Syrian should see what the Tunisians are enjoying in the 8th of May. So the 6th of May. So we will maybe wish that we could have something like that. I will end here with this message that democracy is under attack violently, physically, but the concept of democracy is also under attack. And this is the role of writers, intellectuals, politicians. We need to defend Arab people's right for democracy, in our own countries, in our own localities, but on the same time we should speak to foreign leaders, foreign powers, foreign parliamentarians, and because they also begin to lose hope or begin to repeat that what I could see even as a racist statement, Arabs are not ready for democracy. Yes, there is no interest in the current administration to push for democracy in the Arab world. We saw Macron how he's expecting the little change coming in Egypt or in Saudi Arabia. There are two reasons why people are losing hope in democracy, whether abroad and locally in the Arab countries. It is the failure. Those ugly pictures coming from Syria make people fear, and Libya, make people fear that if we go down this road, we're going to end up like Syria. And that's actually the argument those state sponsors, TV channels and writers and columnists are advocating and pushing down the throat of the Arab people. The other, and that is affecting more locals and also foreign leaders, it is the limited reforms that Arab leaders are doing. In Saudi Arabia, there is a true serious reform. Prince Mohammed bin Salman is leading. Many of my Saudi colleagues are saying to me, you should support that. I said, oh yeah, I do support it. I'm not against it. I do support it. So the argument is, take what you have and build on it. Foreign leaders are also doing the same thing. When Macron stood next to Prince Mohammed bin Salman, he exactly said that we need to support, and he's rightly so, we need to support the Crown Prince in his effort to reform Saudi Arabia, because if we let him down, we will put him under pressure from radical elements who are not willing for reform. So even President Csid is doing reform. You know, the economic reforms, I'm sure every Egyptian businessman, not every Egyptian worker or ordinary citizen, but everybody in business in Egypt would agree that the cutting of subsidies and the freeing the pound from, what is the term in English? The floating the pound, it is reform. And the International Bank is supporting that reform. So those reforms, those limited reforms, and the failure in the Arab world are adding strings to the argument of the anti-democracy elements, people, writers, politicians in the Arab world and abroad. That will give more responsibility on you to resume your active work in advocating democracy and pushing for democracy in the Arab world as a choice to the people and as a solution to safe, failed Arab states. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jamal, for this basically urgent call to those who believe in democracy to fight for democracy. I think that every revolution has a counter-revolution, just like every action has a reaction. So I think this is normal and to be expected that those who don't want democracy are going to fight against the democracy. We have time for maybe two, three questions, but please be very brief so that we can answer the questions very quickly. So we'll start here. Mohammed, have a microphone? Do we have a microphone? Yes, please. Here. Can you stand up so we can all see you?
My name is My name is Mohammed Shinaw from the Voice of America. My question to Mr. Khashoggi is, how do you explain the bulk backing of counter-revolutions of the Arab Spring, especially in Egypt?
We'll take a couple, two or three. Yes.
My name
first sharing information, and then sharing consultation, and finally sharing decision making. Now, sharing information is in the hands of the mass media, and I'm very glad that you are with us here because you are the best to answer my question. We are told here in America that 85% or 90% of the Arabic mass media is in the hands of Saudi money. So does that mean that democracy will never happen until the Saudi money approves the road to democracy by sharing information?
Thank you. One more here.
It's interesting that the three questions you got are from Egyptians. I would really like to thank you for this powerful statement for Arab democracy. I would appreciate if...
Can you introduce yourself, please?
Oh, I'm sorry. Abdul Mawud Dardiri, member of the Egyptian Parliament 2012. I thank you for the powerful statement in relationship to the Arab democracy. I wish you can send a similar message to the West, because I believe the West is not ready for the Arab democracy. And they really need to be prepared for an Arab democracy. The other part of the question, I don't think there will ever be economic reform unless there is political reform. All organizations that speak about transparency, accountability, speak of Egyptian regime as failing on many levels. So I don't expect there will be economic reform in Egypt unless there is political reform. Thank you.
I think there is one more question here. Or more. Okay, so you want to answer these questions first? Okay. Okay, great.
Right. First question, why Gulf countries did not like or did not support Arab Spring? Because they are monarchies. Monarchies don't like revolutions. It's as simple as that. And they were worried that if Egypt succeeds as a democracy, it will have a long-term influence on Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states. I argued against that in a book I wrote, in articles I wrote repeatedly, and I said in my book that yes, eventually, if democracy prevails in Egypt, it will have an impact on Saudi Arabia the same way Nasser had an impact, and Arab nationalism had an impact on Saudi Arabia. But it is a good impact. It will not force Saudi Arabia to turn into a full democracy, because the social contract in Saudi Arabia was working and is still working, that the royal family will rule as long as it provides good life, secure life to the people. So that was working. So Saudi Arabia wasn't under the threat of a revolution. And undermining the democracy brought to Saudi Arabia and many other Arab countries more danger of democracy. The failure, the chaos, the civil wars. It brought Iran into us. By Saudi Arabia not supporting, as it should have, the Syrian revolution, it allowed the Iranians to come into our region. By not supporting a transformation into democracy, a full transformation into democracy in Yemen, it brought Iran into us. So if Saudi Arabia has to choose to see what it lost and what it gained by lack of support to democracy, I think it lost. If it had supported a peaceful transformation into democracy in Yemen and in Egypt and in Syria, Syria is debatable because we cannot blame Saudi. I tend always to blame President Obama for the failure in Syria, but failing to support democracy and Arab Spring resulted in more cost or more damage to Saudi Arabia than democracy and fear of the positive effect of democracy. About your question of exchange of information, it is happening. Yes, the Saudi, the Emiratis and the Qatari probably altogether controlled 90% of Arab media. They varies in the message they do. But today no one has a monopoly on information. Young people exchange information with their who beam to the ordinary people with whatever message has a huge influence on them. You see that in Cairo Street, you see that in Riyadh, you see that everywhere. But the monopoly of information, it is not coming only from owning of the television. It is from the source. The sources are not providing information. So we really don't know much about contracts being signed. We don't know much about deals being done. We don't. The amount of, if you compare here in America, how many times the spokesman for the State Department is standing in front of the media, and a Saudi official is standing in front of the Saudi media, or a Qatari official, or an Egyptian official, there is no comparison. There is a huge access to information in Western democracy. But in our part of the world, it's very much limited. So it doesn't matter really who owns. Of course, it is very important that the states control the media, but maybe it's more important to have access to the information. That's what will make the transformation to democracy. The last question.
About the economic reform, relationship between economic and political reform.
My friend David Attaway is doing a book, an excellent idea, why authoritarian government are into mega projects. Those mega projects are going to be costly, whether in Egypt or in Saudi Arabia. But without a form of a check and balance, they could go wrong. I wish the Crown Prince all the success to make Saudi Arabia prosperous. But I think he will always need some form of a check and balance, because he's investing hundreds of billions of dollars into future projects. And he is doing that depending on his own ability to judge and the ability of a small circle of advisors. Is that enough? No, it is not enough. The prevailing thought that is leading authoritarian regimes today, that we are able to lead. We don't need the hindrance of a parliament, the hindrance of committees. We know what is good for the people. That is what is happening today in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, and probably in most of the Gulf countries, that the leadership is leading in its own. If it succeeds, we the people will say thank you. If they fail, we'll just go quiet.
Thank you very much. I think we will have to stop with the questions. I'm sorry, but we have to go to the Turkish case, which is also very interesting and very informative. And also want to remind you that we have a panel afterwards on Tunisia, which I think is ultimately going to be the real proof that Islam and democracy are compatible, and that democracy is possible in the Arab world. So I think it will be a very interesting panel at 2 o'clock, right after this panel on Turkey. So I'd like to invite the panelists, Dr. Kamal and Dr. How do you say the first name, sorry? Dr. Gunul. And we also have a speaker from Istanbul. Unfortunately, he was not able to make it. Dr. Kamal, how are you? Welcome. So he will join us by Skype later on. And our goal was to have a real debate about what's going on in Turkey. So I think we brought some really important experts on the topic. And this, as you know, for all of us, Turkey was the model, and Turkey was the hope for the whole region and for the Muslim world. So we wanted to evaluate how things are going and where Turkey is going these days. And Professor Asma Afsaruddin, the chair of the board, is going to moderate this panel. So please.
Thank you, Radwan. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to welcome you to this keynote panel on Turkey, which is, of course, a very important country, and particularly for the whole purpose or project of democracy. And in fact, until quite recently, Turkey was considered almost universally as a model of Islamic democracy. And that image has been considerably challenged by recent events, particularly by the attempted coup on July 15, 2016, that left in its wake almost 250 civilian casualties. And President Erdogan of Turkey moved swiftly to squelch remaining vestiges of the uprising, cracking down on those who were deemed to have instigated and supported the coup attempt. And those arrested included supporters of the Gulen movement, as well as subsequently journalists and members of the intelligentsia, among others. Supporters of Erdogan and his government have justified these steps as necessary security measures appropriate in the aftermath of an attempted coup that is understood to be not only a domestic attack, but also an external plot by foreign elements. Detractors of the government and critics of these measures paint a different picture. They have instead accused Erdogan of placing Turkish democracy on a path to self-destruction from which there seems to be no exit, as a recent Foreign Affairs article claimed. So the conversation we're about to have on this panel is a very important one. The future of Turkey has enormous implications for the future of democracy in the Middle East and in the Islamic world in general. And many of us, like myself, who are enormously fond of Turkey and its people and wish them well, are anxiously monitoring the situation. We have 3 speakers today, one of whom will be joining us by Skype, who are extraordinarily qualified to explain to us the complexities of the situation from a number of different perspectives. So without further delay, I turn to our first speaker. Actually, we didn't quite discuss the order, but I'm going to go ahead and volunteer Kamal Kirishji, who is a senior fellow and director of the Turkey Project at the Brookings Institution. Speakers will speak for about 10 minutes or so, and after the last speaker has been Skyped in, then we will take questions from the floor. Kamal.
Thank you, Asma, and thank you to Ridvan for inviting me and us here to discuss Turkey and where it's heading. Thank you to the keynote speaker as well. I share his enthusiasm for democracy and democratization in the Arab world. I also noted how Ridvan referred to Turkey, how Turkey was once a model. That's where I'd like to start with my remarks and then say a few words about what seems to have gone wrong. I was a university professor when AKP got elected in November 2002. I was deeply involved in European integration studies, and the arrival of AKP, having broken away from an earlier Islamist party and its agenda that was uncomfortable with liberal markets, uncomfortable with the notion of civil rights and human rights across the board, only for Muslims as they define them as Muslims, and also extremely uncomfortable with the Turkish Republic Western vocation. AKP brought a whiff of fresh air, excited many in Turkey. We must also underline that reform in Turkey did not start with AKP, it started earlier on. But the arrival of AKP in many ways propelled the country. And at the time, Erdogan put together a very wide coalition that included Kurds, liberal, centrists, as well as those of you who follow the academic literature, Muslim Democrats, a fascinating term, I think epitomizing the possibility of Islam and democracy coexisting and working hand in hand. And I think at the time the West was mesmerized too on the heels of 9/11 that indeed AKP was going to transform a Western-oriented republic which always had difficulties with its diversity, managing this diversity, and difficulty with its democracy. And chapeau to Erdogan and AKP, they did achieve that. When I recall where we stood just about 10 years ago, yes, Turkey was a model. And in exactly 10 years ago, Turkey also got elected to the United Nations Security Council for the first time since 1961 with a huge majority. It was at the peak of its soft power. Well, we are not there. We are not there, and what was exciting about that period I'd like to underline is the way in which AKP brought a formula to manage and live with Turkey's diversity. And to me, the best symbol of that was the way in which AKP permitted LGBT parades in Turkey in 2003, which continued until 2 or 3 years ago. Today we stand somewhere completely different, and I think Asma has just summarized where we are, so I won't go into the details of it. But share with you some thoughts on what is it that brought us here. I cannot claim that I have a convincing answer for this. There were many factors that played a role in this. I just rushed out from a conference at Brookings called The Anatomy of Illiberal States. And the panel from which I had to leave prematurely looked at Hungary, Poland, and Turkey. When I listened to the presentations from Hungary and Poland, I really was shocked. The similarities are unbelievable. Similarities in the way in which leaders, I won't mention names, in those countries and in my country began to dismantle the institution of these countries, primarily the rule of law. Second similarity is the way in which the very pillar of democracy, which is elections, the way in which these leaders, and not naming names, these leaders tinkered with what one speaker said, the technology of elections, and told us how, for example, in the recent Hungarian elections, the Hungarian election system went literally dead for 4 hours. You can imagine what might have happened in those 4 hours. And in our experience, it was a cat that had entered a trafo, an electrical unit that broke out. So we wonder what will be happening on the 24th of June, and maybe questions and answers we may go back to it. Time is very limited, but I think one way in which to explain this drift away from not only liberal democracy, but the very pillars of democracy is power, and the determination to stay on power, and the ability to feel Machiavellianism in your own genes as you move forward to maintain that power and manipulate the system. However, this is where I'd like to come up with my own thinking that I developed, and please allow me to do some propaganda in a book I just published called Turkey and the West, is the following, and it relates to the keynote speech, Islam and democracy. Erdogan and his immediate entourage comes from an Islamist movement that in Turkey we call Milli Görüş, the national outlook. Time is very limited. But when you go into the intellectual tradition of this movement and read the literature from some of the leading personalities, I'd like to share one name because it's a name that is frequently raised and mentioned and referred to by the Turkish president, is Necip Fazıl Kısakürek. And what Kısakürek advises in his writings is that Muslims should have the right to elect a leader and then defer governance to the leader, lock, stock, and barrel. And he calls that leader Baş Yüce, the chief leader. I recommend to you to look up in the internet the law that paved the way to the referendum in April 2017 for the constitutional amendments. In the preamble of that law, you will see references, very natural references, to previous Turkish leaders like Süleyman Demirel, Turgut Özal, etc., quoting them, advocating a presidential system that will kick in right after the elections, if the elections are won by AKP and the current Turkish president. Though I must qualify what I just said, we'll come back to it. But out of the blue, there is reference to this particular personality. Now, this is a personality that represents a political movement that has an extremely narrow view of democracy, if it has, and it's a view that is totally majoritarian. That is, if I win the elections, I have the right to express the will of the people on behalf of the people without regarding the interests and the rights of those who have not voted. And that, to me, is the difference between where Turkey was when Ridvan referred to Turkey as was a model and where we stand, and it would be a real pity if the Arab world was to adopt this particular understanding of democracy in Turkey, if we can still call it a democracy. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for staying admirably within the time limit. Our next speaker is Gönül Tol, who is the founding director of the Center for Turkish Studies at the Middle East Institute.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Ridvan, for inviting us. This is a very nice discussion, and I enjoyed the discussion on Saudi and Iran relations earlier, so thank you so much. Well, when I got the invitation, I initially wanted to talk about Turkey's illiberal state tradition, a state-centric tradition that the AKP ruling party inherited. And how the AKP's neoliberalism played a role in Turkey's current drift into authoritarianism. But then I remembered that I was going to be on a panel with an AKP official. So I decided to cover the things that I wanted an AKP official to address. So that's what I will be covering today. Well, I wish he spoke earlier because I also wanted to hear what he had to say. We're very familiar with the AKP narrative, but he's addressing a Western audience, so I'm hoping that I will give sincere answers. So the AKP narrative is that the country is going through a difficult patch, especially after the failed coup in 2016, and that explains all the steps that the government has taken so far that led to an authoritarian regime. But Turkey had a pure human rights record even before the attempted coup in 2016. In the wake of the mass protests, for instance, in 2013, many of you might recall, they erupted in Istanbul and spread to other cities. The government continued a policy of controlling the media and the internet and clamping down on its critics. Right after following the corruption allegations in December 2013, and the corruption allegations implicated people who were close to Erdogan, Erdogan's close circle, the government intensified its meddling in criminal justice system, reassigning judges, reassigning prosecutors and police, and attempted to exert a greater influence and control over the country's already very politicized judiciary. And since last year's 2016 coup attempt, of course, the human rights situation is much worse. After the coup attempt, the government, there's now a state of emergency in place, and after having declared the state of emergency, the Council of Ministers issued several emergency decrees with force of law, granting unlimited discretionary power to the executive. And I think one of the most contentious issues concerns the extension of police powers to detain suspects for up to 30 days without judicial review. Of course, if you follow Turkey, there are serious problems with the freedom of expression and freedom of association. The Committee to Protect Journalists, for instance, ranked Turkey the worst jailer of journalists in the world. Turkish police have raided offices and detained the editor and 12 senior staff of one of Turkey's oldest left-wing newspaper called Cumhuriyet, alleging that they had published content that was that attempted to legitimize the coup attempt. Just yesterday, a Turkish court sentenced 14 staff of the newspaper to up to 7 years in prison on terrorism charges. According to Reporters Without Borders, a Turkey representative, the journalists were mistreated in prison, including being kept in isolation. In addition to opposition press, the opposition parties are also the target. 12 deputies, including 2 co-chairs of the pro-Kurdish People's Democratic Party, and that is the 3rd largest party in the Turkish parliament. They have been detained for, I quote, making propaganda for a terrorist organization. Since July 15, more than 100,000 civil servants have been suspended or dismissed without any investigation or without any possibility of legal challenge. And these individuals, what is even more concerning is that these individuals are all banned for life from working in public sector, and their titles, their ranks, and their licenses have been revoked for all time. The passports of those who have been dismissed or are under investigation, and also as well as the passports of their children, their wives, they have been cancelled. So I think all of these measures are being applied with an alarming level of arbitrariness. The measures are aimed at those who, I quote, according to the law, belong to, connect to, or contact with, end of quote, alleged terrorist organizations. But of course, the criteria for assessing membership of these organizations is incredibly vague. They have not been specified. And that is partly due to the vague anti-terror definition, and that's always been a problem. But I think currently the government is also, and that was one of the conditions actually the EU has imposed. The EU has been asking Turkey to change that anti-terrorism law, and so far Turkey has failed to do so. Because I believe the government is using the coup attempt as a pretext for clamping down on its critics and using this law. The latest targets of the government's campaign has been a guy named Osman Kavala, who is the biggest, Turkey's best-known philanthropist and liberal activist. He's in jail now, and along with an American professor University. His name is Henri Barki. He was attending an academic conference in Istanbul at the time of the coup, and after pro-government media accused him of orchestrating the coup on behalf of the CIA, a prosecutor issued a warrant for his arrest. And one of the two charges against the philanthropist Osman Kavala is, I quote, being in contact with Henri Barki and foreigners who were among the organizers of the coup attempt. Just last week, it was particularly heartbreaking for me, being the mother of a young baby, a Turkish teacher who was sentenced to 1 year and 3 months in prison for allegedly praising terrorism. She was sent to jail with her 6-month-old baby. And she was charged with terrorism after she said on a TV show, "Don't let children die." That was all. Human rights activists, lawyers are in jail on terrorism charges, and most of these cases, accusations of terrorism, are based solely on actions such as downloading data, data protection software, or publishing opinions disagreeing with the government's narrative on the land movement, for instance. And the situation on the Kurdish front is even worse. As I said earlier, the opposition, the pro-Kurdish party's co-chair is in jail, and according to UN High Commissioner of Human Rights, they documented numerous cases of excessive use of force, killings, and forced disappearances. And I think the most concerning is the massive scale of dismissals of public officials, again, including members of the pro-Kurdish party. And I think all these measures they have all resulted in human rights abuses. These are part of President Erdogan's strategy to consolidate his power and rally the people behind his presidentialism agenda by creating the narrative that Turkey is surrounded by enemies inside, internal and external enemies, and only a strong president can save the country. And of course, this has regional implications. I won't go into detail because we don't have enough time, but I want to say one last thing, and I will also refer to the keynote speaker's comments earlier. He said that the US is not really interested in promoting democracy in the world anymore. For a long time, the US turned a blind eye to whatever is happening in Turkish democracy for the sake of greater geostrategic interests. But in the current context, I don't think the US can afford to do that, because what is happening inside Turkey is undercutting US interests in the region. And the case in point is the anti-Kurdish policies that the government is pursuing both domestically and in Syria. And I'll end with that.
Thank you very much. Our final speaker is Haroon Armalan, who's the Deputy Chair of Human Rights in the AKP party. And are you ready for Skype again? Okay, I think we're going to wait a few minutes while Monji looks into that. Yes. Hopefully. Are we ready to go, Monji? Okay.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, please.
I can't hear you, but I think this part is more important.
Yeah, we can hear you. Can you hear us?
I was trying, so I was waiting to be called, not just right before I speak. Start. I hear other audience, but thank is offered physically and speak in the conference. Is for me to have snippets and that made it very. I would like to start about Turkey's democracy. It's an event that did Turkey. In what I have seen, average about 5%. The representative is 97. That means 900 was represented in 2000 and had 33 the lifetime of year. And we, in 18 years, Prime Minister, and was a good boss. But only 10 rating to a little quite diverse sphere of Turkey. Turkish must not the high army in our history shown with the 2006 accounts managed to infiltrate including military.
Harun, can you hear me? Harun?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, we can't hear you very well because the sound is not very clear. Can we cut the video and just use the voice call, with Skype without the video? Try if we can hear you better.
All right, I'm not that. We can do that.
Let's try that.
All right, is it?
Okay, yeah, keep talking. Maybe we'll hear you better now.
So, about the group, the Gülen Cup state body on elected 15th of July, and they killed they three other people. Governing buildings also police that indeed if we have used this correct describe and ever plan from one blackmailing them. It looks very fake body and man for
Yeah, Harun, we still can't hear you. Can we call you on WhatsApp or something and see if the voice is better?
yeah, possible too.
Okay, let's try. I can call you right now on WhatsApp.
Yeah, hold on 1 second. One second.
Okay, go ahead, Aaron. Can you speak up, please?
Military draft constitution by public referendum. I think this was very important. And the military representatives were removed from constitutional court, and special military courts are waived so that every military member who commits a crime would go to the same civilian court like every other citizen in Turkey. I think this is a quite major development for democracy in Turkey. Turkey has now changed its governance system to presidency, so people directly determine the executive by voting for the president to form this government. And now we are heading to the first presidential elections, and we can observe a very positive reaction by the opposition parties for early election poll, with recent legislation that passed from the parliament that with the 10% threshold is practically removed for the parties who form a coalition in the elections, and they will still be able to vote separately in the ballot boxes. This means a party can be represented in the parliament even if they are voted by 1% of the population. I mean, isn't this amazing that this couldn't be taught before in Turkish democracy? If we talk about economy a little bit, Turkey has tripled its GDP under AK Party ruling in last 20 years. And now we have 3 times more universities than what we had in 2002. In 2017, Turkish economy has grown 7%, and this is the highest in Europe and Asia. IMF recently increased its estimate for 2018. And these are very good developments for Turkey. I understand there are some concerns among DC academics, researchers, and policymakers that the current climate in Turkey. And some of these concerns are based on aren't based on any evidence, and some are legitimate. And I will try to address and I'll try to give clarifications. And let me be very, very clear, and also in reply to what Gönül said. Journalism is not a crime in Turkey, and no one is in prison because they are journalists. The journalists are free to do their job as everyone else within the legal framework of the law. And moreover, no one is above the law. Anyone who is involved in plotting this coup and co-attempt in supporting the killing of unarmed civilians will be arrested and tried in accordance with the rule of law. Just because a criminal has certain conditions doesn't absolve him of his crimes. And we are very proud the heroic work of the different media outlets and their employees did to counter this crew, from CNN Turk to Fox TV. And Turkey has a very diverse atmosphere of media, and we have over 50 nationwide newspapers published every day. And there are 14 of those newspapers are published in a language other than Turkish, such as English, German, Kurdish, Armenian, Greek, French, and Russian. And there are over 100,000 journalists that are working in Turkey, and there are over 150 foreign journalists from 40 countries live and report from Turkey. I mean, there are 24 TV channels broadcast in Kurdish, and only one of them is state-owned. And if I have to comment on the judicial processes, Turkey is party to European Convention on Human Rights, and Turkey is integrated the convention to its constitution. So we have checks and balances in our system. The judicial process and continues in the standards of European Court of Human Rights. And I'm very clear on that. When the domestic remedy is exhausted, all the people have right to apply European Court of Human Rights, and the decisions of this court are binding for Turkey. In some cases, individuals do not even have to wait until the end of the case. For example, if the conditions of detention cause irreparable damage on the same person, he or she may apply to the court to request an interim measure, which enable him to be released until the final decision. And there are 27 applications in this category, and 24 of them are rejected, while 3 of them are still pending decision. European Court of Human Rights finds the conditions of prisons are in convention standards. Yes, there are problems in judicial system, but let me make it clear that we had to revoke positions of almost 4,000 judicial personnel because they had links with Gülen's group, and this group has fabricated the evidences to remove the leftist and liberal army generals from the army with their so-called case Ergenekon to open up space for themselves so they are able to carry out a coup attempt. When you are having such a trauma in your state, obviously things are slower than usual. And it's not easy to recruit new members to judiciary when you have massive number of cases ongoing at the same time. We accept that this is a challenge for our judiciary, and we are working hard to ensure the fairness of these trials and judicial proceedings. However, one must accept that despite these big challenges, Turkish judiciary on its own duty with its checks and balances. For example, when we are now in state of emergency and we have formed a state of emergency commission that's made it possible for state of emergency presidential decrees to be taken to court and challenged by judiciary. This was not possible before this commission, but we wanted our own government wanted that every person whose rights has been violated because of the presidential decree should be able to appeal to higher Turkish courts, constitutional court, and even at the end to the European Court of Human Rights. Of course, there are a lot more to discuss on the current situation in Turkey. I don't know how much time I have, but if you will have more questions, I would like to reply and touch the points of the U.S.-Turkey relations in Trump era, and I'm happy, and I'll try to do my best to answer all questions.
All right, well,
Okay, thank you very much, Harun. Can you still hear us now?
Yeah, I still do.
Okay, very good. So, Asma is going to moderate the Q&A.
all right, well, we listened to 3 of our speakers, and I'm sure their comments have engendered a number of questions and comments on your part. The floor is now open. Please do keep your comments and questions very, very brief and identify who you are before you pose the question.
I saw so many hands shoot up, so I'm going to go to this table. Dana, you're up.
Dina Abdul Associate Professor at the University of Dina Abdul Associate Professor at University of Massachusetts. So my question might not be just to the panel. It is not just for the panel. It might be just a question to throw around. Obviously, I'm very much a humanitarian and very much against anything that violates human rights. However, there's a very difficult equation here. For people who are struggling in the Middle East to democratize, there are leaders who are put in a constant juggle between maintaining power and continuing with the maintaining power and continuing with the democratic process, or being overturned by a coup like President Morsi. So the question here is, when you are faced with domestic challenges, when you are faced with regional challenges, when you are faced with international challenges, how does a ruler maintain their power without violating those basic needs? How does the project continue if it's disrupted by all those factors?
Thank you. Why don't we cluster some of the questions? So I think the gentleman next to Dana, you were up, lady in the green, and Nader. We'll take these four, and then we'll take another round of questions. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Mujib Khan, UC Berkeley. Can you hear me?
Yeah, hold it as close as you can.
Okay. I hope you can hear me, or I'll try to shout. Thank you. This is a very fascinating discussion. And my question is then to both panelists Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu and Gülül Tol, who have been very critical of the situation in Turkey, and Harun Bey, who was trying to defend it. Is there a way for us to be more nuanced in our discussion here? Because on the one hand, you raised a number of criticism. For example, you mentioned the prosecutors who were dismissed in 2013 over the corruption investigations. But in that case, what is clear is a number of them, like Zakaria Oz, were also involved in very shady and illegitimate sorts of prosecutions relating to the Ergenekon and Balio's trials, and were using files that the police had illegally collected in order to remove political opponents, and that's been pretty fairly established.
Would you can I ask you to get to your question?
Okay, so sorry. So in that case, and then in the case of you mentioned Syrian Kurds and so on, the YPG has not been in any sense really a democratic movement inside Syria. So and then for Harun, I would ask. My question is. There are a number of people prosecuted in Turkey, like Şahin Alpay, Nazlı Ilıcak, now in Cumhuriyet, Murat Sapuncu, and Hamid Şık. These people were very critical, for example, of what the Gulenists were doing. And the charges against them are based on guilt by association. So you do have a legitimate right to prosecute people who are involved in illegal or violent activities. But what about people who are just being prosecuted in Turkey for expressing their opinions?
The lady in green.
Marina Alcoa with the Wilson Center. Both the speaker, Jamal Khashoggi, and mentioned the fact that it's important for Western countries to keep up the pressure, not to give up on democracy promotion. And I totally share the feeling and the sentiment, but I have some real doubts about what can be done effectively, because it seems to me that democracy promotion falls into three different categories. One is the pious exhortation, I would say. You know, you have to be more democratic, etc., etc. The second one is the kind of democracy promotion projects that various countries have been funded, that very frankly, I don't think that they have made much difference. They have created a lot of NGOs, but they have not really been terribly effective. And then the third category is that of imposing sanctions. punishing countries that are not making any progress. And what I'd like to ask of you all is, what is it that what is it that you want the West to do in order to show that they are not giving up on democracy?
Okay, thank you. Actually, I'm going to ask our panelists to respond to these three questions, and we'll do a very brief second round of questions.
May I also pose a question to Harun Bey? Yeah. Okay. So I would like to read the teacher's full remark, who is now in jail with her 6-month-old baby. So these were the things that she said on TV, and that's why she was charged. These were her exact remarks. So she said, "Are you aware of what's going on in the country's east? What's happening here is misrepresented on TV. Don't stay silent. Please show more sensitivity as human beings. See us, hear us, and give us a hand. I'd like to address the teachers who have abandoned their students. How are they going to return here? How are they going to look those innocent children in the eye? What a pity. Don't let people die. Don't let children die. Don't let mothers cry." So I would really like to hear from Harun Bey what he thinks about these statements and what he thinks about this woman being in jail with her baby. Okay. So in response to the three questions I proposed,
Very good questions. I wish we had time to go into the details of it. Dina raises a difficult question. How do you maintain power and at the same time continue with reform while you face a coup attempt? And Khan asked a very specific question, naming a prosecutor, Zekaria Öz. To me, the two are connected. Zekaria Öz was part and parcel of a, dare I say, judicial process that was rigged and that targeted a particular profile of people in Turkey. Officers, academics, prosecutors, police chiefs, etc. A good part of the media and the government apparatus remained silent until this mechanism turned against the government. And this is the context in which the 1725 December corruption file or case needs to be understood. It clearly was an attempt at a coup, an attempt to change government by extra democratic means ahead of a local election in March 2014. And this mechanism manned and womaned to some extent by Gülenists. I have to reveal my colors. I belong to those people who believe that the Gülenists had a major role in the coup attempt in 2016. However, I would like to leave an element of doubt and let history for us to reveal the details of what actually happened in July 2016. However, those officers, those diplomats, and those teachers, those judges and prosecutors who were in the system made their way into the system as the government opened the doors for them. My students or our students at Boğaziçi University couldn't make it into the Ministry of Foreign Affairs because a law had been adopted in 2010 that introduced a new type of multiple choice exam whose keys we discovered since the end of, since the coup attempt, the keys to the questions were handed over to students who were close to the Gülenist or other places. Now, Turkey and the government and AKP faces a huge challenge to look in the mirror and recognize responsibility for what happened. As long as there is no effort to look into the mirror and face responsibility, there will always be this awkwardness that is also captured in the movie on Death of Stalin, when the Politburo gets together and says, we were misled. When Şahin Alpay, facing the court, said, I was misled, why is it that I'm being kept in detention at the age of 80 with all kinds of health ailments? And others who can get away by saying, we were misled. This is the challenge that Turkey faces. AKP did a brilliant job in the 2000s and liberated Turkey from its ailments from the 1990s, extrajudicial executions, detentions, torture, etc., etc., emergency rule, and now we are back in a situation where the Turkish Republic is going to have its first ever election held under emergency rule across the country. Will that election be free and fair? The OSCE, the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, publishes reports after every election on the basis of the monitoring they did. I invite people to go and look at those reports for the 2015 elections as well as the constitutional referendum in April 2017. Turkey has a challenge ahead of it. I don't know if I was able to answer all the questions. Marina, you have tough questions. Time is limited. I don't want to monopolize this, but I do want to go back to the question what the West can do effectively. There was references made to the European Court of Human Rights. To my utter relief, a lower court in Turkey that ignored a ruling by the Constitutional Court to do with Şahin Alpay's case, without going into technicalities, had to abide by the Turkish Constitutional Court ruling when the European Court of Human Rights intervened. I want to live in a Turkey where the lower court respects its own constitutional court or upper court rather than have to rely on the European Court of Human Rights. This is the kind of a citizen I want to be, but I wonder where we would be if the European Court of Human Rights wasn't there in the first place. Thank you.
And I also want to go back to Marina's point. I think it's a fair point. This notion, this promoting democracy notion is problematic, and we all know that. But what I was specifically referring to is, first let me say that you're right, maybe the US doesn't have that much leverage, given the state of relations between the two countries. The US might not have that much leverage, but there was a time when it did. And instead of promoting a dialogue between the PKK, the Kurds, and the Turkish state, the US turned a blind eye and treated Turkey's domestic Kurdish problem as just a domestic Kurdish problem, and helped Turkey in its anti-terrorism efforts. So for the US, it was an anti-terrorism issue. It was not a matter of democratization. It was not a matter of human rights. And I think that was the problem right there. The fact that the US never had a real Kurdish policy was the problem. And now it's undercutting US interests. But as Kemal mentioned, maybe the European countries, especially the European Union, has much more leverage over Ankara. especially with regard to customs union, and the customs union I think can be used as a carrot. But the problem here is the Western world now resigned itself to the fact that it has a transactional relationship with Turkey. The European Union countries, they have their own reasons. They need Erdogan on board for the refugee issue, and the US, obviously, they want to have access to Incirlik Air Base, and they see Turkey from a very narrow perspective as an important partner in the fight against ISIS. So everything else is not a problem for the Western world. And I think that transactionality, looking at relationship from a very transactional perspective, is very problematic. Because both for the US and European countries, what is happening inside Turkey is not just domestic politics. Turkey is not Saudi Arabia, it's not Egypt. It's a different country. So you cannot really have, if you have a true dictator running the country, you have, that country is not going to be governable. And no one has an interest in an unstable NATO partner. But at this point, I think, yes, there are just so many problems. And there's a lack of vision and political will in Washington to engage Turkey and to address Turkey's domestic failings, democratic failings. And there are so many mixed messages coming out of Washington too. I mean, with regard to Erdogan, on the one hand, you have people like Michael Flynn promising Erdogan to hand over Fethullah Gülen. And President Trump, he wants to engage Erdogan. He doesn't want to be the US president who has lost Turkey. And there are others who are saying that, we really have to speak truth to Erdogan and address these concerns. So there's a lot of mixed messages coming out of Turkey, and there's just not there's not a constituency in Washington that would push for, at least in narrative, in rhetoric, to address those concerns. It doesn't have to be in front of the cameras, but even when the cameras are not there, I'm not sure if those issues are raised. Maybe the only instance that the issue of human rights was raised was with regard to Pastor Andrew Brunson, who's been in jail in Turkey. But I don't think there was a debate beyond that. And I think that's a huge problem.
I would like to give Harun Armahan a chance to respond. Is he still on the line? I hope.
Yes, he is.
Okay.
Yes, I'm still on the line, but
Please go ahead.
So you need to repeat the questions to me so that I can reply.
You had a question. Go ahead.
Yes, so I would like to read you the teacher Ayşe Çelik's full remarks, and I would like to know which part of those statements constitutes an act of terror or supporting terrorism, because the teacher is actually calling for peace. So she said, are you aware of what's going on in the country's east? What's happening here is misrepresented on TV. Don't stay silent. Please show more sensitivity as human beings. See us, hear us, and give us a hand. I would like to address the teachers who have abandoned their students. How are they going to return here? How are they going to look those innocent children in the eye? What a pity. Don't let people die. Don't let children die. Don't let mothers cry. How is that supporting terrorism?
When Gündüz speaks, I can't really understand. But I understood the question. I will answer this time, but next time, if someone closer to the microphone can speak, can raise the question, I can hear better. So, in terms of Ayşe and some others who are charged from terrorist propaganda, we are not the state, we are not body of judiciary, right? And I'm not claiming here that every decision made by judiciary is correct. Just because a party is inside the government doesn't make a party responsible for every decision made by judiciary. But what I'm saying for Turkish judiciary is that we have our checks and balances, and we have our agreement with European Court of Human Rights, so that in the decisions the people disagree, and when they appeal to higher courts in Turkey, if they still disagree, they can go to European Court. hand, I would like to reply to Dr. Kish's comment on Shahin Alpay. When Constitutional Court made the decision about Shahin Alpay and the lower court didn't practice that, the lower court has the right to make changes, but he may not comment, he may not do the change according to the interpretation of the higher court. But then the Constitutional Court of Turkey made a second decision after 1 week. If you are following me, the Constitutional Court made the second decision, said no, the decision has to be made this way, and then Shahin Alpay was released. So Shahin Alpay was not released from the decision of European Court of Human Rights, but Shahin Alpay was released after the second decision of Constitutional Court of Turkey. So still the checks and balances works for Turkey. And let's not forget that Turkey is now under fight of two terrorist organizations, ISIS and terrorist PKK. And we are fighting with those terrorist organizations, perhaps one of the scariest terrorist organizations and most dangerous terrorist organizations in our history. And unfortunately, we don't see the support that we would like to see from our allies. And maybe maybe a little bit answer to one of the questions. The United States is supporting and providing arms to PYD. I'm sorry, this is a terrorist organization we are fighting, and at the same time, if our allies providing guns and support to this terrorist organization, just because this terrorist organization is fighting to another one, we cannot accept this. And the United States has promised us in the meetings very clearly and very openly to cut the support to PYD. And we are still seeing that the support is provided to PYD. Look, let me make a very honest comment. We have done a lot to make the United States and Turkish alliance to be much more stronger. And we have seen, like Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu mentioned in his speech, that AK Party is coming from a background of believers that more people were more Islamist. And it was perhaps AK Party who convinced all those people that democracy and Islam can work together in Turkey. And we fight a lot for this. And we had a lot of criticism when we were trying to increase the relationship between Turkey and United States and European Union. And we tried so hard. And even at the times that we put so much effort with United States and the European Union, we didn't see enough support from our allies. This is a very unfortunate fact that I can share. Even now with European Union, even though they have accepted terrorist PKK as a terrorist organization, they are allowing the supporters to make protests in Brussels, in the center of Europe. I mean, can you imagine ISIS supporters are making a protest in Brussels? Can you imagine that a political party leader from the US or members of Republican or Democrat Party going to funeral of an ISIS suicide bomber? I mean, we have seen those things in Turkey. And now when the legal proceedings are applied to those people, now the questions are raising about the state of democracy in Turkey. I mean, whoever is jailed in Turkey for propaganda of terror would be happening the same thing in London, in Washington, if they were members of ISIS. I am very sure, and I can discuss this for hours with anyone. And I'm still saying that if there are wrong things in the judiciary, there might be things, something like this. But we have our checks and balances, and we are happy to see that our judiciary is working and trying to fix those.
Thank you very much. I regret to say we have run out of time, so we cannot do another round of questions. But I do want to thank our panelists for their contributions to this very important conversation. So shall we have a show of hands with them? And then we're just going to move immediately to our next panel, which is back. It is back, right, in our other room.
Just to save time, we're going to stay here for the next panel on Tunisia. and we'll go to the other, the final panel will be in the other room. So we're going to stay here for the next panel, but thank you very much for an excellent discussion. I wish Harun was here with us in Washington. He was supposed to be here until a few days ago, and as you know, they announced an election, early election in Turkey, and that's why he couldn't come. They made the decision that he had to stay there. So we really regret that he wasn't here, because I think we would have had a more useful discussion. But I think it was very, very enlightening and very informative. So thank you very much both for joining us, and thank you, Harun, also. So now we go directly into the next panel on Tunisia. Can the panelists please come to the podium or to the head table? So the news we have been hearing since the morning from Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Iran and Turkey has been a little bit depressing. Hopefully we're going to hear a slightly more optimistic story from Tunisia. And we are very happy to have 4 excellent speakers. 2 of them flew from Tunis. One is a member of parliament. Csid is a member of parliament, and now they are voting the law for the local elections, which, as you know, will take place in 2 weeks, May 6th. So it was not easy for him to leave parliament and come and join us today for this panel, for this conference, but I really appreciate your coming, Osama. And we also have Khalid Shoukat. He's one of the leaders of the Nida Tunis party, which is the ruling party. Nahda and Nida, as you know, are the 2 main parties in Tunisia, and they are ruling in a coalition together. And Khalid also is an intellectual. He has written over 20 books on democracy and on Islam and democracy. And we are very happy to have Khalid with us. We have also Eric Brown, who is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, and who's been following Tunisia very closely and has written a paper recently on a partnership or strategic partnership between Tunisia and the United States. So we are also very happy to have Eric Brown with us. And we have a 4th panelist, Andrew Marsh. Is he still here, or where is Andrew? Hopefully he will. There he is. So Andrew is a fellow at Harvard, and he is writing a book on Rashid Ghannouchi. He has interviewed him recently for a very long time, and so he will be talking about his new book and thinking of Rashid Ghannouchi in Tunisia. So I think it will be a very enlightening and hopefully a slightly more optimistic panel than what we've had so far. I also want to tell you that CSID has been extremely active in Tunis since 2011. So please take a copy or pick up a copy of the annual report of CSID Tunisia. It's on the table outside, and it will show you the kind of activities and programs that we have been doing in Tunisia to strengthen and support democracy and the consolidation and transition to democracy in Tunisia. So with that, let's start with Osama Zrayer. It's okay, he can come here. So 10 minutes, please.
Okay. Not easy. Hi everyone, Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much to CSID for inviting me to this very important event. In Tunisia, we talk about this event, and I'm honored to represent my party, to represent the Tunisian parliament, and I'm more honored that a few minutes ago we just approved the law about municipality with more than 2/3. exactly just half an hour ago, and I think it's really, really simple. We promised that we're going to do it before the election. Was not easy at all, running out of time and trying to, yes, and more than 2/3 of parliamentarians, they voted for this law. It means that consensus may have a lot of difficulties, but it's working. It's working without consensus. I mean, it's really problematic. I'm happy to be here. Actually, I should be in the parliament. I'm a member of this committee that worked on this, the Committee on Administration and Armed Forces, and our work should, we're late 1 week, that's why I plan to be in Tunisia and to be here in this week. But the consensus committee that worked on this law, and with the consensus committee, we don't mean only Nahda Nida Tunis. We sit around the table where we have Popular Front that accuses us of many things, including the assassination of Shukri Belaid, Alayarho, and Mohammed Ibrahimi, and many other things. So this way of choosing, doing politics, sitting around the table, trying to provide real results to people, it is the way that we choose in Tunisia. It is difficult. It is slow, very slow, compared with the high expectation of Tunisians. And it is normal. Human being, they want solutions immediately, but it is the right way. I remember in 2012, I was member of the Constituent Assembly. When we were discussing the Constitution, we were in the first draft, and then we just started half of the first draft with 3 drafts, and we were watching in Egypt that they already approved the constitution, and actually they did even a referendum. We were a little bit angry because we were so slow, but during the second draft we were working on, actually they did another referendum, so it is not being quick, it is doing a concrete job that includes everyone. So I have a lot of things to talk about, but we don't have enough time. So what I'm going to say, it is few things quickly about what is happening now in Tunisia, but then I'm going to focus on the points that I want to talk about. Currently, the main important issue is about the local election. As I said, we just adopted the law about the local powers implementing the constitution, the democratic one. We have now hard and very, very difficult negotiation with the union. It is really complicated, and it is, taking a lot of our effort. We have a negotiation at the level of presidential negotiation on the document of Qatar that gave, as a result, the national unity government that we have. Today we're working on a second version of this important document that includes all political parties and national movements, and it is not easy. We have a possible changing of the government after the local election, and the negotiation already started now. Nothing happened really serious, but there are some political party and national organization from the civil society that they are asking change of the government, and we have also right after this election we're going to start again to prepare for another election, the presidential and parliamentary election in the end of the 2019. I'll start by the good news. So the 5 challenges I think we have in Tunisia: the full implementation of democratic constitution, the security threat, the economic and social challenge, the corruption, and the political challenge in terms of consensus and political party system. When we talk about full implementation of the constitution, we promised that we're going to implement the constitution in 1 year after the adoption, after the election. But it is not easy to implement the constitution, a democratic one, in a system where democracy was completely absent. And mainly because it's not easy to find consensus between different political parties on on the implementation of the constitution. And three main problems we have with the implementation of the constitution. First is the local election, but I think starting from today, I mean, we're in a very good step. Second, the constitutional court. Third, the transitional justice process. When we talk about local election, it's amazing, not only in terms of another day where people they are going to go and express their views, but also because we have 57,000 people that they are candidate running for election. 57,000, maybe for the US is not that big number, but for Tunisia as a 10 million people, it is a huge number. For the first time, having 57,000 people running for election, trying to move people to go to vote, trying to express their ideas, how they want their cities to be changed. Of course, the first party that had the capability to present for the election, complete a list, 350 list is Nahda and Nida Tunis. There is a very small difference between Nahda and Nida Tunis, but a lot of talks about a real change on the political system in Tunisia. We're facing, yes, difficulties, but with the local election, it's clear that Nahda and Nida Tunis are still the main big political parties. And we have other political parties, of sure, but there is a big difference between Nahda and Nida Tunis that they were able to present full lists, in all 350 cities, municipalities, and then we have after, I don't remember very well, I think the Popular Front with 150. So there is at least 200 municipalities that...
Less than 100.
Less, yes. The important thing, at least for Nahda, to say about the local election, from 7,200, 3,700 are people running for the election under 35 years old. 43% of the people that they are running on the list of another party are less than 35 years old. We're building a process and we're trying to include youth that they are going to be the real, the leadership with other political parties of the democratic transition in the next years. We did another thing. We opened our list for independence. It is not an easy job. You have all your members. You say, okay, step back. I'm going to open the list to candidates outside the party. It is not easy at all, but the result is really, really incredible. So we have 55% of the people running with another list are independent. And we don't ask to those people to be part of the party. We ask them to share and to implement the program that we discussed with them. And of course, as you know, the law in Tunisia about the election oblige all political parties to candidate head of the list 50-50. It means not to have in the list 50 women and 50 men, but in the head of the list. So we have 175 lists headed by women and 175 headed by men. Anyway, just a few numbers. I have many others, but my point is that this local election is really, really important in terms of mobilizing people, giving back a new space for democracy, for participation, and also for distribution of power. Till today, the distribution of power that was in the hand of only one man, of course, was in the Palace of Carthage. What we've done with the constitution is that we had a distribution of power between the president of the republic, which is directly elected, so he had important powers, but he is sharing those powers with the president of the government, and we have an important part, which is the parliament. But all those three, active institutions, democratic institutions in our country, they are all in the capital. the real guarantee for democracy in Tunisia is when we're going to distribute power from the capital to the whole country. And this is the local election. The Constitutional Court, we approved the law, everything is set, but it is not easy to find people completely far from any political influence to put in the Constitutional Court. So we didn't succeed yet, actually, in finding people far from politics, any kind of influence, to be member of the Constitutional Court. We're working on this, and I think in a few months we're going to have the Constitutional Court. The transitional justice process, it is the difficult part, problematic one. Maybe I'll leave it to my friend from the Tunis to talk about it. The security threat, it is a complicated point. We're part of the coalition against ISIS. This is working very well. The situation in Tunisia, it is good. We're protecting, the whole country. There is no space for terroristic groups in Tunisia. Even the few of them, they escaped in the mountain. They don't have that space anymore. Most of them, they were captured or they escaped to Libya. And our security forces, they become much more confident, and they get a lot of, they become really experts on fighting terrorism. This is after Bingadan, the attack that the terrorists, they wanted to do and took part of the Tunisia. And this was a total failure and was an important message to all Tunisians, because our security forces, they were able to stop a kind of attack that happened like Mosul, you know, all those people attacking one city, a city where the state is completely absent, total south, marginalized for decades. So the state for them doesn't mean really a lot, but they proved to stand with the country, to stand with Tunisians, to stand with the security forces, and this gave really an important, our security forces, they become much more confident. The situation in Libya for us is very problematic, because at the end, Bingadan attack, the political assassination, the groups, Tunisians, that they are, most of them, they are in Libya. The Bingadan attack and the political assassination, they were organized, all of them, from Libya. So Libya, till we have a stable country, we're going to have difficult situation in our country. Last point about this security threat, youth and extremism. We have a complete opposite situation compared with the 2011 and 12. Those youth that they were 16 years old, 18 years old, thinking about going to liberate, I don't know what, and so on. Where the process is totally the opposite. People, they become smarter. They understood that this is completely wrong. I mean, no youth in the poor regions that they were attracted by fighting in the name of Islam. They found themselves killing other Muslim people and so on. So the situation is still difficult, but I think we're moving in a very good way. The third one, which is the challenge, the economic and social challenge. Here we have the problematic part. In Tunisia, we say the revolution is the revolution of freedom and dignity. With freedom, we mean the democratic system. With dignity, we mean the economic and social progress. The numbers are good. The trajectory of the numbers are good. They're still very low. But GDP, unemployment, tourism, agriculture, they are numbers that they are growing by time. Okay. Reforms, we're doing a lot of reforms. Economic one, I mean the reform of the central bank, the partnership, public-private sector, and so on. But the real challenge is the implementation of those reforms. Stakeholders, that they are there since years, thinking about the years before the revolution, they're not so happy of implementing those reforms. people, they still in the situation of the state provider. So people, the way that we built our state after the independence, the Bourguiba way, which was good at that time, it is not good anymore in our time. We need to change this, and people, they have to rely not only on the state, but to be proactive. Corruption, the fourth challenge, it is really problematic. We have an incredible, not only perception, actually we see this corruption at different level. We have a campaign led by the president of the government and sustained by most of the political parties, and we're doing a lot of reforms in the parliament to reverse this and to challenge this corruption problem. Last challenge is the political one. I don't have much time, but I thought this is one of the most important points. We're moving from political Islam to be Muslim Democrats. This is another way of doing politics in Tunisia. We're completely separating the dawah and politics. We're learning from the experience of Egypt, of Turkey, of Morocco, of Indonesia, of all those countries, because we want really to succeed, to present a moderate conservative party that it is full of the identity of the country, but at the same time it is completely democratic, not only within the state, but inside our political party. And we believe this is the way to present a real antidote for against extremism, and there is a secret. I'm trying to develop this, but I don't have enough time. It is not easy to understand how another is doing this process, and people, they say you're doing this, because you're weak today, and to stay to be part of the system. But once you get to the power, you're going to change. It is not true, because we have to think more and more why another is this way. And if we go back to the 70s and to the 80s and to look to the people that they were inside another, who what are the discussions that they were discussing, and so on. I think it's important to understand this is a real process, and we hope that this process continue and to succeed. Consensus, yes, for many people it is a problem. We are aware of the problem of the consensus. But it is the only way, and it is the way that is giving real success to Tunisia, and it is the way that others in our region didn't follow. So we may have real difficulties, but at the end is the one that it is working. We're thinking more and more how to have a sustainable consensus. So how to continue on this, how to think to the future, and to build something that can stay. Party system in Tunisia, it's really, really problematic. Here we have real difficulties, and it is normal. We didn't have any political party activity. In one day, 200, in a few months, we have more than 200 political parties. The problem also is that many political parties, they were built thinking in a presidential way. And here I remember during the constitutional work, most of political parties, big and small, they were fighting to have a presidential system, when it's completely the opposite. If you are a small party, you should fight for a parliamentary system. We have this wrong way of doing politics in Tunisia till today. People, they are still thinking about the one place, the one guy that provides and gives everything to everyone. By time, people, they are convinced of trying to have a real and sustainable party system. The absence of a strong government is still really problematic, and this is in the electoral law. The President of the Republic finally announced a possible change on the electoral law. This is something that in another we thought about it, and we proposed this many years, a few years ago, since the election of 2014. Last point, it is the enforcement of the democratic institution. We're still working in a very difficult situation. think about the parliament. I mean, we don't have offices. It's the number of people that they are working in the parliament. It's really nothing compared with the other democratic parliament. So the idea is how to enforce democratic institutions. Without enforcement of democratic institutions, they may not provide real solutions to the people, and people maybe they get tired. We think, and then we're going in the right direction. We need your support and your ideas and your criticism to think and find the wrong part of our process. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, sisters and brothers, I would like to thank you very much, my friend Radwan Masmoudi, for this kind of opportunity to speak to you about our experience, our democratic transition process, which started in 2011. Before 2011, we speak about the Arab exception, because we see that all nations, all parts of the world going to the democratic way. Only the Arab world is an exception. Now we speak about the Tunisian exception. And to be exception is good, and it's not good. It's important to have a successful story, but to be in this situation, in the corner, in this area, it's dangerous. And till now we are thinking how to find a way to protect our experience and to say to our region that we didn't have any project to share, no, maybe to export our experience to you. Radwan has invited me to speak about challenges of this experience. And I would like to mention 5 main challenges. We have a lot of challenges. Maybe some of them we could find a solution in few years, but for a lot of challenges we need time, we need more time. I have been in Budapest to see the experience of the Hungarian people in this way, and maybe after 20 years a lot of people told me they didn't have the feeling that they are finished this process. They are still busy with their democratic transition process. And I think 7 years or 10 years are not enough to say that Tunisia is finished with this process, because we have 2 levels, maybe a constitutional, a political, low level, and we have also a deep level, a cultural level, a mindset, mentality level. And to change mentalities, it's not easy. The first challenge, for example, how to develop democratic, real democratic parties. Our main parties, the majority of them are till now busy how to develop this democratic character. In 7 years, if we see political parties as tools, not as goals, these tools should be developed, and it's not easy. For example, when we speak about Islam and democracy, there is a question till now, big question till now, how to develop democratic political parties with Islamic or religious background. The same In our case, in Nida Tunis is related to the reformist national movement. It's a historical movement started in the 19th centuries, but the first political party of this movement is established in 1920 by Sheikh Abdulaziz al-Thalabi, and then by the president Habib Bourguiba, etc., etc. We see ourselves as the fifth version of this experience, of this historical movement. But anyway, inside us, inside our party, we have this feeling that we didn't have enough democratic heritage to use it in this process. The same we can say also about the left or the Front Popular, for example. The Front Popular is a coalition of 13 left political parties. Till now, they have a lot of theories which not really democratic, and they should make more and more reforms to have a real left movement in Tunisia. If we speak about the Arab national parties, some of them are related till now to dictatorship regimes, and they didn't have any problem to be in Tunisia Democrat and to be in Syria or in another country somewhere dictator. This is the first challenge. The second challenge which we have now at the moment is hope. How to keep hope, especially inside the young generations. The young generations are not satisfied from this new political elite, and how to develop a new dialogue with them, how to stimulate them to be more active in the political life, how to give them the opportunity to contribute positively in the society and in the political life. Maybe this occasion, this opportunity of local elections could be a good chance for them, because the majority, 90% of the candidates of these 7,000 seats are their age is less than 40 years, and this is a good signal. This is a good point to have maybe in the future more young people, not only in the municipal councils, but in the political institutions of this new democratic regime. The third challenge is how to support democracy to create development, economic and social development. And this is maybe the biggest one, the biggest challenge which we have now, because the people generally make this comparison between the time of democracy and the time of the dictatorship. Till now, the economic and social situation is not good enough, and to make this social and economic development, we need more stability, more political stabilities. We have 10 governments in the last 7 years. the average age of governments is less than 1 year. And in 1 year, you couldn't develop any process in this economic and social way. The fourth challenge is consensus. As you know, everything was based, this successful story is based on consensus between the two big political parties. Nida Tunis represented the secular forces, and Al-Nahda represent the Islamic moderate forces. And this consensus was the key to make a lot of compromises which we need to write the constitution, to organize the election, to form governments, to legislate more than 300 new laws, among them 50 laws strongly related to reforms. But we still have problems to guarantee this consensus culture, this consensus process. We have difficulties inside the two big parties, but in general inside the society. Our culture, our heritage is more based on conflicts than on consensus, than on compromises. And we should change, we should find solution to keep consensus available, especially on the deep level, on the game rules. And the last challenge is struggle against terrorism, because terrorism and war against terrorism is expensive, especially for a country like Tunisia with limited resources. For example, I give you an example. We have spent around 4 billion dinar to support our military and security institutions in this war against terrorism. But 4 billion dinar is a high, very high amount for a country like us with a budget of 35 billion dinar a year. Not only that, but it's not a war, it's not a local war, it's not a national war. This war is regional and international, and we need really cooperation with our region and with the international community to could win this war, because this war stimulates a lot of youth, our youth, and make the atmosphere generally in a situation where we can't develop other things which are important for the daily life of our citizens. But we're still optimistic, and we still have a lot of positive energy, because what happened in Tunisia was the result of 2 centuries of reforms. We have written our first constitution in 1861. It was the first constitution in the Arab and Muslim world. We have a very good and solid reformist heritage, and that helps us to inspire and to go on with our transition democratic process, because we didn't have any other alternative like democracy. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Radwan and Asma and Nader and everyone for the invitation. I'm a political theorist, not a policy analyst or political scientist, and my interest is mostly in democratic theory, which is admittedly just one, perhaps the smallest facet of explaining democratic transition and democratic consolidation. I don't think anybody believes that the only or even the most important factor in explaining the success of democracy so far in Tunisia, the failure of it in Egypt, and the risk of it in Turkey has to do with political ideology or the interpretation of Islam and democracy. So nobody, I don't think that's the case. At the same time, I think it is very important. I think the idea of legitimacy for a political system or a constitution, and the long-term sense that a political system and a constitutional order more or less harmonizes with your conception of morality, your conception of human rights, your conception of the purposes of what politics is supposed to do, is a perhaps not a quantifiable but also a not insignificant factor. And so I approach this sort of, I'm finishing a book on what I call the invention of popular sovereignty in modern Islamic thought. Sheikh Rashid al-Ghanouchi is a very important figure in this. He's an important figure in the book that I'm writing. And I also just completed in December and January a series of sort of 6 or 7 day dialogues with him that are hopefully going to be forthcoming as a book later this year in English and in Arabic. And so what I want to speak a little bit about today is a series of transitions. First, what was the theory of Islamic democracy that was formulated by Ghanouchi and others in the period before the revolution? So Ghanouchi has for a long time been acknowledged as a particularly democratic thinker within political Islam or within the broad Islamic movement. What does that mean, and what particular theory of democracy was being articulated? There is no single theory of democracy, even in Western secular democracy, so it shouldn't be problematic at all to ask what were some of the particular contours of the harmonization between Islam and democratic commitments. But since the 2011 revolution, there's been an extremely complicated constitutive moment, a moment of creating a constitution, extremely complicated party politics, legislative politics, security politics, and it would be astonishingly surprising if Ghanouchi's own ideological views before the revolution told us anything at all about the behavior of Nahda or other political actors. But nonetheless, it's important to articulate what is the relationship between party ideology and the understanding of Islamic political theory and this new constitutional order. And accordingly, Ghanouchi has written a number of important essays and speeches and articles that address some of these questions. And I want to say a few things about that. And then to conclude, I want to sort of introduce what I think were some of the 6 or 7 most intriguing themes that came out of our dialogues, and then ask a few questions about what are some of the possibilities for thinking about the relationship between your moral or religious commitments to an ideal political order and the kinds of compromises that come out of constitution making. So just very, very quickly, when we look at some of the high sort of ideal theories that were elaborated, for example, in Ghanouchi's book, Public Freedoms in the Islamic State, what was democratic? Why do we call this a particularly democratic theory? But what were some of the specific Islamic elements of this that make it a distinctive theory of democracy? So the first, like with almost all Sunni political thought, the claim is that the people, and only the people, is the source of all political institutions. The Sha'ab or al-Ummah, Masdar al-Sultat. But this is not just political offices, not just the head of state, not just areas in which the obligation to engage in shura is institutionalized, but also legislative and religious institutions. So any idea that there are religious experts or scholars that are evaluating legislation from a Sharia compatibility standpoint, in Ghanouchi's earliest theories, all of those offices derive their legitimacy only from popular ratification and appointment and not from their own epistemic authority. Second was a very, very radical commitment to the rule of law. Nobody is above the law, and there was also no law that necessarily predates the political system. So the political system creates the law that is being applied, and the entire political system is held rigorously to the standards of the rule of law. The third is that the constituent authority of the people is fairly widespread. So in classical Islamic theory, you might say, well, the people elects the caliph or the head of state or whatever it is, but the people is not free to create new institutions or to change the office of the caliphate or to radically create new constitutional offices. In not only Ghanouchi's, but especially in his, the authority of the people to use their power of shura and legislation on the basis of public interest was very, very widespread to figure out what the constitutional order ought to be. And fourth, the role of the people, not only in legislating on worldly, dunyawi areas, or areas that pertain to the merely public welfare or maslaha, but also determining what aspects of the Islamic Sharia are to be applied in political life, was to a large extent assigned to legislative and even public forms of institutions that the people participated in directly. So that's why we refer to this as a particularly democratic theory. At the same time, it must be noticed that this is not merely an articulation of liberal secular democratic theory. And so I want to point to four important aspects of Ghanouchi's pre-revolutionary political philosophy that I think are particularly not represented in the post-revolutionary order. The first is that this is a perfectionist theory of political life. The purpose of politics is not just to manage conflict, not just to get rid of terrorism, not just to deal with the IMF, not just to deal with agricultural policy, but to make humans better humans. The purpose of political life is to create the ideal conditions for as many people as possible to be the best possible Muslims they can be. And that's very, very clearly articulated in this political theory, including in the reprinting of Public Freedoms in the Islamic State that came in 2015. Second, unlike a lot of democratic theory, particularly Madisonian or Montesquieuian democratic theory, where the purpose of political institutions is to balance ambition, balance powers against powers, and to manage conflict, in Ghanouchi's democratic theory, the purpose of all institutions is to represent and harmonize a certain kind of moral unity. So there is a division of institutions. There's a judiciary, executive, legislative power, but they are not meant to be at odds with one another. They are meant to be united around certain kinds of moral purposes that are determined by Islam. And so he directly discusses Madison and Montesquieu and says why an Islamic democratic theory can never accept the radical pessimism that's embodied in those theories about the possibility for political and moral unity. In turn, when I refer to this as a kind of vision of a republic of virtue, so it's thoroughly Republican, in many ways it's deeply democratic, but it's a democracy that both relies upon and assumes, but also aspires to, self-governance of a people that is united around a conception of virtue. The idea is that it is a community, and not just a society, that is united around moral purposes, united more or less around religious commitment, and united around the idea that self-governance is about both applying your knowledge, but applying your will and your morality towards certain kinds of collective goals. So it's a different kind of virtue, or a different kind of republic, than one that sees politics as managing conflict and managing the inevitable competition between self-interest. And so finally, this is a vision of democracy in which the Sharia is supposed to remain sovereign, but it's a kind of deliberative Sharia. It's a Sharia that emerges out of institutions public opinion, and the participation of the people in trying to figure out what the appropriate representation at a particular time and place is of this dialectic between text, tradition, and the contemporary moment. Now, needless to say, none of those latter values or aspirations appear to be represented in the 2014 Constitution, which isn't a criticism either of the 2014 Constitution, nor Ghanouchi's or Ennahda's commitment to that Constitution. It's just kind of a brute fact about political life and the cunning of politics. In fact, I think it's a little bit like what our last speaker was saying. In Tunisia, we don't have any other option. There's no sovereign military. There's no sovereign religious authority. There's no great power. There's no possibility for Tunisians to manage their political affairs except through political dialogue amongst themselves. And that's what makes it different from a lot of other countries. But since this period, without for one second questioning Ennahda's commitment to the constitutive process or to the 2014 Constitution, which obviously they played a large role in creating, Ghanouchi has written a lot of things, speeches and essays, discussing what is the approach to certain kinds of aspects of the Constitution and the new political order that are somewhat questionable from the standpoint of traditional Islamist ideology. Three questions, I think, are repeatedly brought up. One is the absence of any reference to the Sharia in the Constitution. Second is certain language that you see in the Constitution, like referring to human rights as universal, as opposed to merely recognized or appropriate. And third, the general understanding of what kind of political life is imagined by this new order. And I think in reading a lot of his various essays, four big themes are repeated over and over again. The first is this astonishing redefinition of what the Sharia is. So when he's asked, how do we deal with the fact that there's no reference to the Sharia? He says at one point, the Sharia only came down, was only revealed for no other purpose than limiting government and limiting rulers. Now, everyone knows that that's not true, and everyone knows that that wasn't even his view in his writings, but it's an astonishing statement that any form of government that limits government and limits the power, the arbitrary power of rulers, fulfills the purpose of the Sharia. Second, I think most of his thinking before the revolution, and most of Islamist thinking since Maududi, the arch metaphor for Islamic political thought is this metaphor of the entire people as God's caliph, right? All Muslims have received God's authority on loan, and then they delegate it to rulers. And according to this, the metaphor of the founding moment of political life in Medina serves the purpose of establishing that Islam must be political. Why is Islam deen wa dawla? Because that's how Islam began in Medina, unlike Christianity, unlike other religious experiences. The Medina covenant, or the Sahifat al-Medina, is now for Ghanouchi in the post-revolutionary period the kind of arch metaphor for political life, but it's put to a completely different purpose. For Ghanouchi now, what the example of Medina establishes is the commitment to a radical kind of pluralism. So the covenant of Medina was not only between Muslims, not only between Muslims and Jews, but also between Muslims, Jews, and pagans. And what he uses this to establish, he even says at one point, we Muslims are fortunate that our political life began in a moment of radical pluralism. And so what he does is to say there is nothing more natural or Islamic or legitimate than for us to organize political life around a very, very broad kind of pluralism that doesn't just include mutual recognition between Islamic schools or mutual recognition between Muslims and the people of the book, but really without regard for any kind of metaphysical or moral harmony whatsoever, except for moral harmony around the purposes of political life. And then finally, there's this idea that the most important thing in politics, particularly constitutional politics, is consensus per se, agreement in the conditions of the existing pluralism. not agreement between reasonable pluralism or agreement between those that are committed to some particular conception of virtue, but whatever the state of pluralism and disagreement is now, politics must seek agreement given that reality. So on questions like the universality of human rights, the absence of Sharia in the Constitution, the whole controversy around what does takamul between, the complementarity between the genders mean exactly. Time after time, he says, if this was a matter of misinterpretation, misunderstanding, and disagreement, he refers to the Sharia itself as a mawdu'a ikhtilafi, a subject of disagreement, and that alone is reason enough to defer it to some other time. So consensus with actually existing pluralism is the kind of arch value governing politics. What the Islamic sort of doctrinal underpinning of that is not always clear. During these dialogues that we conducted, we covered a wide range of things, from his earliest childhood to his political formation, his intellectual journey, the history of the Islamic movement, and so forth. But my own interest was largely in the philosophical and theological issues. And I want to just bring out 6 major themes that I thought were most interesting and I thought would be most appropriate for today. The first is that there is an attempt on his part to argue for a kind of continuity from his previous views to the present. What we agreed to today is kind of what I was always arguing for. Nobody, I think, really is persuaded by that entirely. Second, and most interestingly, is a kind of skepticism about the state per se. And this is very fascinating because, as we all know, this capturing the state or using the state as a means to bring about an Islamic society was the political goal of political Islam for most of the 20th century. And there's this turn to seeing the state as less of a vehicle for the realization of the good life. The state is primarily seen as an agent of harm, and thus its own harm should be reduced. 3, society as seen as a space of radical pluralism of ways of life. So in addition to Medina, another metaphor that came up was 9th and 10th century Baghdad. And he said, look what you had in Baghdad. You had atheists, materialists, philosophers, Zoroastrians, all of these things. And was this any harm to us? Did Islam collapse because the state didn't interfere with this sort of thing? So there's an increasing view that the state should be a sphere that just provides a space for the plurality of different kinds of ways of life. And so what I think his thought is kind of moving to is what the Harvard political philosopher Judith Shklar referred to as a kind of liberalism or democracy of fear, which is that without trying to say what's so great about individual liberty or autonomy or what's so great about this or that, it focuses on the idea that politics is full of all kinds of dangers, almost limitless dangers: torture, repression, jailing, massacre. And the primary focus of politics should first be on minimizing the harm that state and power and politics can do. 2 more points. 5 then, what happens to the Sharia? And I think there's a fascinating sense in which you sort of get something like Plato's Euthyphro question, which is that on a previous version of Islamic legal theory, you might say that there is a vision of the law, and legal theory, the scholars arguing about the law, is the mechanism that is most likely to result in the most accurate interpretation of God's will. So God's will exists, and we have a kind of best chances of figuring it out through legal theory. I think he's coming also very close now to saying something like this. If we in a public sphere have institutions that are free and uncoerced, whatever comes out of these sorts of things in a free and uncoerced way through public opinion and deliberation is as close as it gets to identifying something as being legitimate according to the Sharia. And then finally, a small skeptical note, which is to say the commitment to social and political pluralism can't be questioned. At the same time, there still is this view that at the intellectual and rational level, all sane and well-functioning minds would result in acknowledging the existence of God and the truth of Islam. So we had this discussion about Kant's antinomies of reason, and he flat out said, this is wrong. Reason can prove the existence of God and the veracity of Islam, and this is not internal to reason. So there is this sense that, that the radical moral pluralism that exists has to be accepted, has to be lived with, but might not necessarily be a condition that shouldn't be sort of engaged with and perhaps transformed over a long period of time through persuasion and education and those sorts of things. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. As I mentioned to Radwan, I still have copies of Muslim Democrat from early 2000, which was very much a founding institution which gave rise to Csid, as I recollect. And Csid has really come a long way after all of these years, and it's discharging an enormous civic obligation by keeping alive this discussion, especially now. And it's a real testament to the steady leadership of the organization for sticking to it. We need it. I have the unenviable task of speaking after these three very eloquent speakers. I was supposed to speak a little bit about challenges. And Dr. March does such a wonderful job talking about the theory of things. I do live here in Washington, so I'll say a little something about the policy side, as I have come to see it. As everybody has said, Tunisia is now widely hailed as the Arab Spring's only success story. And the dismal realities that we see elsewhere in the Middle East, I should say the soul-crushing realities, we're talking about the largest displacement of humanity since the end of World War II, makes Tunisia's efforts to form itself as a civic republic all the more impressive, and I would say heroic. And I emphasize that word heroic because Tunisia doesn't have to necessarily choose the path of civic republicanism. But I also use that word heroic because I think it is something that the United States, as another large and successful and old republic, needs to honor. And by honor, I mean that doesn't simply mean good speech, but it also means deep investment. It means coming up with a strategy. It means coming up with a policy that sees far, well into the future, and helps to create the conditions in which Tunisia's patriots from both Ennahda and Nida Tunis and from other parties have the security, the economic and political conditions in which they can build their republic and make it last. Our own republic, as Americans and everybody else here, there was a time when it wasn't quite clear if we would make it. But fortunately, we did have friends from France. The President of France was here just recently, and we had a lot of support from Lafayette and many others way back when. There was also a time when our founding president, in his farewell address, referred to the problems that our republic faced as one of the major threats that our republic faced when we were trying to form ourselves. And he described it as the insidious wiles of foreign influence. At the time, you will recall, we were a very fractious and factionalized polity, trying to figure out a way to form ourselves, trying to figure out a way to put ourselves together. And as it happened, we had a Hamiltonian faction and a French-loving Jeffersonian faction, which wanted to go at each other, couldn't find a way to talk to one another. And sure enough, by the 1790s, when a dispute begins to break out, which ultimately leads to the Napoleonic Wars, had we not had the far-sighted leadership of people like Washington and Adams and others to see farther and to see ourselves through and to choose a path of neutrality through that intra-European rivalry, we would not have had the political space in which to pull ourselves together and form a republic that has in fact lasted. I'm, in the broadest sense of the word, an American liberal. And like a lot of other liberals, I speak the language of rights. I speak the language of individual freedom, because I do think that by creating the conditions in which individuals have freedom, It produces all the great prosperities and the benefits and the capacity for moral improvement that we spoke about earlier. But we do ourselves as liberals a bit of a disservice by not speaking the older language of republics, and that is the language of sovereignty. That's the language of civic union. That's the language not just of human rights, but also of human obligation and of civic obligation to others. That language goes back to a deeper philosophical condition that understood that the heterogeneity of human society can't be escaped. We human beings cannot exit that reality. And the challenge of politics, I would say, is to try to figure out how to deal with that fundamental heterogeneity of societies. If societies attempt to subordinate or to suppress that heterogeneity, what ends up happening is you end up creating societies that don't succeed. You end up creating republics that fail. You end up creating tyrannies. You end up creating empires. You end up breeding resentments and violent faction, which ultimately proves the undoing of politics and makes politics impossible. I bring this up in part because, the heroism of the Tunisian Republic is really quite profound when you consider it against the backdrop of what is in fact happening in the Middle East today. As Radwan and many others, including myself, has argued, the US has a strategic interest in seeing the Tunisian Republic succeed because it shows that there's another way forward. But more fundamentally, it's not just that Tunisian Republic addresses the problem that Daesh and other terrorist groups pose. It's also that the Tunisian Republic is happening against an unprecedented political and ideological convulsion in the Middle East, in which the sources of anti-republicanism have been unleashed. And it's not just the Daesh or the so-called caliphate movement. It's also the anti-republicanism that we see in the Csid government in Egypt. It's also the anti-republicanism that we see today in Turkey. I've written publicly, and I do believe that in 2016, we witnessed the fall of Turkey, the fall of the Turkish Republic. And I say that not with any sort of misplaced nostalgia for the old laicist Kemalist republic, which frankly I think had run out of gas in the 1970s. And it had only been until really the 2000s when Westerners began to take note of that reality. I'm not nostalgic for that, but I am nostalgic for the fact that Turkey had a whole series of institutions which had maintained the basic norms and had nourished the possibility for the many different peoples of Turkey, the different ethnicities, the different faiths, the different traditions, to at least begin to work out some of their differences and to come together and to maintain their union. I think Turkey today is much weaker off, and I'm sorry to say, I think it's much, much more insecure because of the path that it has gone down. And it's up for and I should also say that one of the bigger tragedies is Asia Minor, Turkey itself, has one of the largest concentrations of Republicans in the broadest sense of the world in the Middle East. And by that I mean not just Kemalist and liberal Republicans, but pious Muslims who understand that their life as citizens and as believers is much better off when not being ruled by an erratic and harsh authoritarianism. I think that fundamentally the strategic problem that America and all the friends of republicanism in the world need to try to address in the Middle East today is dealing with this larger crisis of governance that we're seeing. It is when you have a government that fails, that is what gives rise to the possibility for violent faction. That is what gives rise to the possibility for radicalism. And when you talk to people in Cairo, when you talk to people in Baghdad, when you talk to people in Sulaymaniyah or Erbil, everybody looks at Tunisia because right now Tunisia is showing a very different way forward than all of the other polities in the region. And for this reason, because I do think that the United States has a selfish, strategic, but also high moral interest in seeing the Middle East become a livable place once again, we have a strategic interest in seeing the Tunisian Republic succeed. The Republic, as was mentioned, has established a democratic consensus. Yet democratic consolidation by its very nature requires a long-range effort. And right now, Tunisia is beset with massive security, governance, and economic challenges. We need to, from a practical perspective, address those. But I have to say that one of the things that's making the addressing of those challenges so complicated right now is more fundamentally a failure of politics. As we know, there is political deadlock in Tunisia. That political deadlock, particularly in the run-up to the municipal elections, is contributing to disputes within the parties and between the parties, which is making it very, very difficult to drive forward the deep structural reforms that Tunisia needs to consolidate its republic. Creating the institutions of civic republicanism, which allows a society as diverse as Tunisia to be able to deal with these problems, is going to take some time. The role I think that the United States can play in helping Tunisians do this is by creating the best possible circumstances for sovereignty, another key Republican term. And by sovereignty, we Americans, we do tend to, I think, interpret and understand sovereignty a bit in a limited fashion these days. Particularly, we tend to focus on the security side of things. And I will say, you know, the Tunisian military has acquitted itself in a very noble and decent fashion, particularly since 2011, and it's not using violent force against Tunisian citizens. It is a partner, I think, for establishing and forming that republic, and it's a real asset, and I'm delighted to see that there's much, much deeper collaboration between the Tunisian military and the militaries of the United States and of Europe. But we also cannot neglect the political and the economic component, because without getting the politics and the economics right, sovereignty will not be nourished over time. A sovereign republic will not be established. Just as a practical matter, the economic side of things, you know, we talk a lot about IMF, among other things. Our Western tools, the European tools, which were invented after World War II, they're pretty good at helping to stabilize regimes. They're not very good at helping to stabilize countries. And we're quickly, I think, here in Washington, trying to figure out, particularly when we look at the instability in West Asia and in other parts of the world, trying to figure out what new practical tools we can develop to actually help people themselves, to give them the tools, the possibilities to help improve their situation. There is discussion even in this administration right now about not just reforming, but actually turning OPIC, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, into a larger body with more funds that can act in a country like Tunisia, where we have profound strategic interests, that can act to actually de-risk the situation from the perspective of American enterprise, to get involved in a country like Tunisia at a time when Tunisia is still working out the regulatory and legal environment that's required to actually attract foreign investment. These are the kinds of tools, this is the kind of thinking that we really need to avail ourselves of, and the kind of policies that we need. Beyond that, on the political side, I'll just go back to what President Washington had brought up, the insidious wiles of foreign influence. Tunisia is, on one level, it's very much deeply part of the Arab and the Islamic world, and it's also part of the Mediterranean world, and it's also part of the Society of Free Republics. Dealing with all of those different actors, those different polities around the world, and how they act on the Tunisian Republic and act on the polity itself, that's a really, really difficult thing to do. Profoundly difficult thing to do. I think Americans, particularly from the viewpoint of us trying to establish a strategic compact with Tunisia, needs to appreciate just how deeply Tunisia is enmeshed in the larger struggles across the region. And we should develop a whole of region diplomacy with our allies and our protectorates, particularly in the GCC states, to make sure that we're not working against one another in such a way that contributes to dysfunction or contributes to an environment in Tunisia where the formation of Republican institutions is inhibited or indeed obstructed. So with that, there's so much to be honored in what Tunisia has accomplished. There's so much that's heroic there. The story needs to be told. And when the story is heard, I do think it will resonate with a large enough number of Republicans here in the United States, and that will hopefully step up and be the friend that Tunisia needs. So that's all I'm there.
Well, thank you very much for all four excellent presentations, and I think optimistic presentations. Tunisia is still work in progress, as we have heard, but at least it's going in the right direction, and we are very hopeful that it will continue and it will succeed. So we have about 15 minutes for Q&A. I'm sorry, but we're running a little bit behind schedule, so please go ahead. Do we have a microphone?
Maybe I could do without.
No, because it's recorded. So.
It's being recorded. Thank you very much. Dan Whitman at American University. Radwan, as we all know, was a great prophet 15 years ago. Very few people thought that Islam and democracy could even appear in the same sentence, but you were a prophet. And what happened in 2011 certainly bore you up. Every speaker has sort of addressed my question. In 2011, many of us were euphoric. We thought, oh, this is really astonishing. And then I think you, Radwan, in 2012, when asked, will this spread to the region, you were doubtful. And maybe that was the more prudent opinion. It did spread. And the results have not been good. There's been a lot of backsliding. So my question is, I'd like to hear from Tunisians. Do you feel that you are or could be part of an international movement? Your own transition is not consolidated, we get that. As you are working on making this heroic gesture, I agree it's heroic, as you're working internally, can you or should you be considered a model for other countries in the region?
Okay, thank you very much. Marina?
Thank you. Both representatives of the political parties put a lot of emphasis on the idea of consensus and the need for consensus. And I quite understand it in the political circumstances of Tunisia now. But where does consensus end? And where this focus on consensus ends up by undermining democracy? Because democracy, after all, requires a system of checks and balances. And if you are all, there is need for consensus on the basic rules of the game. But at this point, you have an alliance between the two largest parties in the country that makes it virtually impossible for any opposition to develop, or any real opposition to develop. And that is not very good for the democratic process either. So I'd like to hear a bit more from your fathers.
Okay. Jamal? Here.
I need my Tunisian friends to bear with me. The news you brought out with excitement about the passing of the law of the municipal councils. I looked them up on Twitter. There's about 5-6 tweets. 2 of them are mine. You need to lead. You need to give an example. You need to do something about it. I know you are very much reluctant because you are worried about the pressure you might get, because you know that there are enemies of democracy in Tunisia. But it is really unfortunate that this example, this shining light, is not being seen. And just later on check how much the Arab world is giving attention to this great news. You are excited about it. There's hardly a mention of it. That shouldn't be. Even Al Jazeera did not report the news. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we'll take one more, and then we'll go for a second round. Nader?
Andrew, that was a brilliant presentation. I can't great. Wait to read the book that you are about to publish. So one theme that often emerges in terms of understanding Islamist politics and Rashid Ghannouchi in Tunisia in particular is this argument that some people have articulated that had the Tunisian Ennahda party been able to obtain majority support in the first elections that came about, and had there not been these countervailing forces that were forcing them to make compromises, that Ghannouchi's transformation that you've documented would not have been as progressive as it has become. In other words, there was a realization that the most that Ennahda could get was 40%, but if they could get 80%, there would be less of an incentive to make the type of compromises that Ghannouchi has developed over time, and they could have proceeded in a much more majoritarian direction with less of a commitment to sort of liberal values and to respecting the rights of others. Do you have any thoughts on that particular, that particular hypothetical, option? That it was something unique to the, the dynamic of the power distribution in terms of election results post 2011 that forced Ghannouchi to make these compromises. Because if you read some of his earlier writings, the one that I teach in my class about participation in non-Islamic government, that famous essay where he says, look, we don't have the option to realize our ideal sort of Islamist values because we're constrained under dictatorship. But if we ever do have that option, then we will realize that particular sort of Islamist vision. This is, of course, in the late 1990s, which gives you a sense of where he was thinking at that time. So do you have any thoughts on that general sort of, hypothetical critique that sometimes, you hear with respect to Tunisian Islamist politics more broadly?
So we'll take very quick answers, please, because I want to do another round of questions. So please try to keep the answers very brief. Okay. Andrew, you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So I have 3 points, very quick points to make in response to that. One is that one thing I think about Ghannouchi is that his thought has always sort of bounced off what the currents were in going on in Tunisia at that time. So you had the bread riots in the late 1970s, and then he says, well, we've always been sort of committed to social justice. So there's always been a sense in which his particular understanding of Islam and Islam as a political doctrine has developed in relation to what else is going on and what's seen as what the pressures are from outside of the movement. And so it's not surprising that that should also be the case since 2011, that he has to make do with what reality has proposed. And so if they were a majoritarian party, first of all, I think there was some reluctance to be a majoritarian party because of the responsibility that comes with it. I think you definitely would have had a lot of symbolic differences, right? It would have been much easier to include some kind of symbolic reference to the Sharia or other sorts of things. But I do think that you would have had an attempt to create institutions that were very, very similar in form to the kinds of institutions that were created in 2014. But if if these are offices that are held by people with different ideological persuasions, of course the policy priorities are going to reflect that. But the third thing is I wanted to sort of invite Usman if he wants to say something about it. I think a lot of that depends on what the internal debates within Ennahda were. So Ennahda is a broad tent even within itself, right? It represents a lot of different ideological trends. And it would be very interesting to know, if he's willing to speak about it, how strong the demand was within, whether it was the political bureau or others, for more ideological aims as opposed to meeting the specific kinds of crisis politics that Tunisia was dealing with at that time. So it'd be interesting to know how much that there's something within the party that is being held back.
Okay, thank you. Khalid?
2 points. Maybe the first question of our friend there concerning the international support of our experience. I didn't have the feeling that we have received enough support I give you an example. The last year, Tunisia mentioned it in 2 blacklists, European blacklists. It's not we can't understand that.
Not last year, this year.
Yeah, last in 2017.
But one of them was 2018.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, recently.
Anyway, the last time.
Yeah.
The last time. And for us as Democrats, it's not acceptable. For example, the old regime of the President Ben Ali didn't have this issue. It's not mentioned as
What blacklist?
2 blacklists, 2 black
For
lists
financial-
on financial and
for
economic.
money laundering.
Yeah.
And what's the other
Anyway,
one?
it's not important. Any blacklist. Why you mention Tunisia in a blacklist? It's not acceptable. It's something unique in the Arab and Muslim world, and for us it was really painful. Maybe our relation with the states it's stable. But the support, the American support, it's not also enough. We need more support for this experience could continue, especially in this time, the time of the international financial crisis. This is the concerning the first question. The second question is concerning consensus. Why we need consensus? I have mentioned 2 kinds of consensus. One is related to the deep level, to guarantee the respect of the democratic game rules, to have a new democratic constitution, to develop this concept of civic state, because something new to resolve this conflict between these 2 big blocs, secularists and Islamists. We need consensus. Without consensus, we can't go on. I agree with you concerning the second kind of consensus related to the government. But when you see the results of the last elections, no party could make a government only. Like the situation, for example, in Germany. Finally, the socialists accepted to be with the Christian Democrats again in a coalition. It's also our case, our issue. Nida Tunis has 86 seats in 2014, and the Nahda has 69. We have a parliament of 217 seats. The majority is 109 seats. We didn't have enough majority to make a government with one party, or with 2 also. But this is limited on time. I think if we have new results, different results in after the election of 2019, maybe we make something different on this level. And I believe on alternance. But alternance when you have a stable democratic system. In this time, we didn't have that.
Thank you. Osama?
Yes, thank you. International support, actually, the US and the European countries are the main supporters of Tunisia. At the end, the democratic countries are the ones that are really supporting. Yes, there are some Arab countries, or maybe in 2012, 13, but at the end, the real main supporters are the democratic ones. And this is important for us to tell here in the US that this support should continue from both sides, Democrats and Republicans. It's very important for us. Otherwise, this model we're not going to talk about any model. We're going to face our difficulties, mainly in the economic one, and we're going to lose our experience. So the achievement, it's important, and we need to support this and know-how and technical assistance. We're not talking only about money. We're not talking only about security engagement and support, which is very important, but we should diversify. Maybe we should not talk only about democracy and participation, which was something really important during the last 6-7 years. And about the blacklist, yes, it is true that it was a bad, decision, and we blame the European institutions, but at the same time we have to take our responsibility of not doing and not implementing and not improving our financial system in Tunisia. It is not that bad, actually, and this is the wrong part, to put us in this kind of blacklist with some other countries where the situation is completely different. But at the same time, we have to assume our responsibility, and in fact, in few months, we're going to be out of those blacklists. When the consensus is going to end. And then let's say that it's not a consensus 100%. We have a lot of differences today. Transitional justice is one, and there are other differences at other level. Less, not that very important, but we have differences. The way that we're facing is sitting around the table and trying to find agreements, and sometimes we don't find any agreement, and there are examples of this. And then we need to think and to recognize that democratic transitions need large majorities, very large majorities. No one can face the challenges that you have in front of you. So until we arrive to a situation where the country is really stable, where the constitution is very well implemented, think about the point that I recognize the constitutional court is not there yet, and so on. So maybe by the next election or the one after, we're going to have a stable country. At the end, the consensus was not a choice. No one in the Tunis presented a government that stood there less than 24 hours because they didn't have the numbers of votes. And then we sit around the table and we managed to have a government, and today, again and again, we're going to find solutions and go on. But yes, no one is thinking consensus forever. Check and balances is really important, and we have those instruments in our constitution. So the system was not built to have only consensus way. It is the transition period that obliged us to adopt this until we stabilize our country. We don't need to change any constitution. We're going slowly move to a normal situation, normal democracy, with all its difficulties and not the difficulties of a democratic transition. Media in Tunisia, yes, it's really a problem. Maybe we have to talk more, and I believe this achievement of today, it is really, really important. I worked for this at least 1.5 years, talking only about this law, without talking about the period and the part in the constitution that we did. This law is not perfect. Have a lot of articles that I don't like, but this is consensus. This is what we can achieve today. And maybe years later, we're going to see what is going to work, what is not going to work, and we're going to change it. So at the end, I can say that it is an important achievement. It is clear, again and again, and there is a reason that Tunisia is not presented in the Arab world because people are afraid. And in Tunisia, actually, we don't have this way of thinking that we have a successful model, let's present it and let's export it. Because we didn't start from any model. We started from a white paper. We tried to learn from all the experience that we had in the region. And we tried to put on the table our problems. quickly on the points that you talked about, honestly, since 2013, I don't remember very well when we opened discussions on ideological issues. It's political. Mainly after the last Congress, the National Conference, in 2 years ago. There was a lot of ideology during the time of the work on the Constitution, and after the Constitution, a lot of work presenting the papers, the official papers for the Congress, for the decision of the separation between dawah and politics, and some other issues, what is our policy for the country and so on. But after that, I don't remember very well. Yes, last few months, but it is a political way of talking. The President of the Republic is thinking of presenting a proposal about the Mirath heritage. Mm-hmm. So it is again somehow connected. So the debate is going to still to be there, but I feel it is more political, less ideological.
Thank you. Eric, you have anything to add?
Perhaps something on the consensus question. I mean, pure consensus is never going to be achieved. It can only be imposed. And I think that accepting that reality with some humility is really important for democracy to survive. It forces us to focus, I think, on what was referred to as deep consensus, about ensuring that we all understand that the union can't be broken, and that now that you have a constitution, one must also begin to develop and internalize a tradition of constitutionalism. A love for that polity that was formed, and understanding that that polity is in part what allows us to carry on the conversation about what our politics are about. That is the fundamental institution that I think Tunisia is still lacking. That deep sense within the parties, within Nida Tunis and the Nada, from my perspective, there still is a lot of doubt about whether there is actually people on the other side, or for that matter within the party, who have all agreed on the rules of the Constitution. And that doubt leads to fear about what the other side or what other actors within the parties are doing. And that fear has very adverse political effects. And the challenge now is to have leaders who can help to build that tradition of constitutionalism going forward, to be able to work through these problems and to know that perfect consensus is not within our reach. It never will be in our reach if we also choose to remain free.
I'd like also to answer very quickly the question about Tunisia as a model, and I think Tunisians in general, especially now, are really afraid to use that language as a model for two reasons. First of all, because they will be seen as a threat to other regimes and other countries in the region, and Tunisia can't afford that right now. But the second one is because Tunisia really, they don't see themselves as a model yet. It's work in progress, and it's way too early to talk about a model. They have made progress, and they think Tunisians are proud of the progress that they have made, but they certainly don't see themselves as a model yet. There are still many, many challenges, and we have learned from the experience of other countries, as was mentioned, I think, by Khalid, that transitions take roughly 20 years. So we still have about 12 more years to complete our transition, inshallah, God willing. And then maybe Tunisia will become a model in 12 years from now. It's too early, despite all this enthusiasm and progress, to talk about a model. And frankly, if you talk to Tunisians on the ground, and as you know, I spend a lot of time in Tunisia, a lot of Tunisians are not happy with the situation right now in Tunisia. And they will laugh at you if you say Tunisia is a model. They will say, what are you talking about? So We have to be realistic. I think Tunisia has made a lot of progress, especially compared to the other countries. I think consensus is the key to keeping the unity. And that has not worked in other countries, and we see what happens when you don't have that consensus between the parties. Consensus is not going to solve all the problems, but at least it has kept peace and has kept stability and progress and Tunisia moving forward. But I think we still have a lot of challenges, especially the economic ones. And then, if Tunisia becomes a model, we don't need to talk about it, because you don't need, a model doesn't need to, it speaks about itself. It doesn't need people to advertise for it. It will become attractive by itself. But I think we're still far from that. I think we still have a lot of work to do. So, thank you very much for this panel. I'm sorry we ran out of time for questions. We have one more panel. I beg you to stay. I know you're all tired. We're all very tired. We're going to take a break, 15-minute break, and then come back. We have one more panel from 4 to 5. We have 4 papers that I think you will really like and really will be a good wrap-up to what we have been talking about today. And they're all going to be in the next room or here.
There's 2 panels.
No, we're going to combine them because we don't have.
Okay. We're going to go to the next room.
Okay, so we're going to go back to the other room. We have 4 papers and we're going to put them together and finish by 5 o'clock. So please, drink some coffee and come back.
Namir.